Today on Between the Lines, the author of the best-selling memoir of all time, Mitch Albom. I'm Barry Kibrick. Mitch is an author, playwright, journalist, and screenwriter. But it was his memoir, Tuesdays with Morrie, that made him a household name and one of our nation's most cherished writers. With his latest book, Have a Little Faith, he gives us another true story and takes us on a journey of discovering life's purpose and the divine spark inside us all.
I'm a writer today because I was a reader when I was 11 years old, and it was...
You do not need to prove your state of happiness to anybody.
Most of these speeches were as much as a month in preparation.
Characters, the heroes in this book, are seekers of truth in a story that involves a lot of corruption.
You don't get a chance to really talk about what's real, and this is the first thing to do.
Mitch, it's a pleasure having you on Between the Lines. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome. Thank you.
Listen, I want to start off with your own words. Why not? It's appropriate. You're Mitch Albom. This is a story about believing in something and the two different men who taught me how. It's about two men, Rabbi Albert Lewis and Pastor Henry Covington, as you call it, a universal tale of all faiths.
Yeah, one I knew for many years. Albert Lewis was my childhood rabbi. And so his character in the book, basically from the time I was cognizant, was in my life. And as a child, I ran away from him any chance I got. If I saw him, I ran the opposite direction because he was the big man of God. And I ran and I ran and I ran. And then 9 years ago, when he was 82 years old, I happened to be at home and he pulled me aside. He said, "I want to ask you a favor. Would you do the eulogy at my funeral?" Which totally threw me because, A, who was I to do a eulogy for the guy who does eulogies, and B, why me? I wasn't particularly religious or anything. And this sort of threw me into this going to see him and trying to get to know him as a man to be able to speak correctly at his funeral. That was world one. World two was Henry Covington, a guy that I met in my town where I live now, Detroit. Total opposite, an African-American pastor whose early life had been in crime and drugs and incarcerated, and who turned his life around one tragic night and became ultimately a pastor in Detroit and now ministers to very, very poor people in a broken down section of Detroit in a church that has a 20-foot hole in its roof through which rain and snow come in. And I was in his world and I was in the old rabbi's world, literally flying back and forth. And although on paper or in photographs you couldn't find two people who were more different, I found something that I think was the same, and that became the underpinning of Have a Little Faith.
Well, you know, it's funny too when you first meet Henry, the pastor. He even says he was in synagogue once, but he was there to rob it.
Yeah.
I thought that's a great. You get a great way of meeting him.
He was about 400 pounds, maybe more, and he was wearing a white T-shirt. He was sweating. And he came out, he held out his hand, and he said he was Henry the pastor. And I said, if this is a man of God, I must be the man in the moon. And we sat down. Within 5 minutes, he was telling me he'd been in jail, he'd been a drug addict. And although I appreciated his honesty, I have to say when I first met him, I was like, isn't there a point at which you get disqualified from the pulpit? You know, like, okay, you just have too many black marks on you. Isn't there a minimum test score you have to achieve? But I think the book is a bit of a story of learning to trust that which you are initially distrusting of because it's different. And that's, I think, a bigger lesson about faith, that a lot of us don't trust our own faith or denominations within our own faith or other people's faiths because it's not exactly what we're used to.
I love this awareness that you come to when you say, as is often the case with faith, just as you're talking about it, I thought I was being asked a favor when in fact I was being given one. That's what really runs through the book is, in a sense, we never, when we're seeking favor is not when we find it, it is when we're giving favor. That's what you found throughout this.
I should have known it because even back in Tuesdays with Morrie, when I was going through that, one of the expressions that Morrie Schwartz, my old professor, told me that stayed with me was giving is living, not taking. Giving. Giving is when you feel most alive, and he did in his final days too, not when people were telling him, well, we feel so sorry for you, you know, we love you. That was fine, but he felt alive when he gave. And this sort of proved itself over again, that here was this old rabbi who was saying, would you do my eulogy? that sounds like, do me a favor, I want you to do something. But by virtue of asking me and leading me sort of back to getting to know him, getting to sort of rekindle my interest in faith and my background and other people's faith, he was doing me a great favor. You know, as it turned out, I got a lot more out of it, I think, than perhaps even he did.